I think that depends on who's making the assessment. I mean, for the Israeli government, for the Israeli military, the argument that they have made in the past couple of days is exactly what you said, that these hostages were being held in a densely populated refugee camp. Some of them, at least some of them, may have been held by families in that camp, and there were lots of armed fighters in the area. And so the argument from the Israeli military is that in the course of trying to extract these hostages, they came under fire by Hamas and by other militants, and they had to return fire, and that is what led to these potentially hundreds of deaths in the camp. And so for them, the blame is entirely on Hamas. Now, when you speak to some people from, say, the American military or other Western militaries, they give you a slightly more complicated picture. They're surprised that Israel was using air support, was calling in airstrikes and very heavy bombardment on what was a densely populated refugee camp. And so, again, I think it really depends on who's asking the question in terms of how you assess this.
Yeah. As long as hostages are recovered, do you think this takes the pressure off Netanyahu in just holding off on any stop to this campaign?
For him, at least for a while, I think it will. He's been stuck with this dilemma for months now of whether to agree to a ceasefire that would release some of the hostages but stop the war for at least a period of time, or whether to push ahead with the war. And what he and his right-wing allies have been saying is that only military force, only military pressure can free hostages, not diplomacy with Hamas. So I think for them, the fact that they've freed 4 hostages is going to be seen as a vindication of their preferred strategy. I don't think many other Israelis will see it that way. I think if you just look at the numbers, there have been 7 hostages freed since October through military raids like this, 4 over the weekend, and then 3 last year. There have been 109 hostages freed through diplomacy to date. So diplomacy has been much more effective at getting hostages out. And there are probably dozens of hostages who have been killed in military action, in Israeli strikes even, over the past 8 months. So for many Israelis, this is going to be a reminder that there are still hostages alive, and the best way to get those living hostages out is through a deal. But I think for Netanyahu and his allies, they're going to try to spin this a different way.
Yeah, and you know that we got the glimpse of that with Benny Gantz's departure, saying he believed that Netanyahu was only orchestrating this, to try and survive politically. I mean, how damaging is it to Netanyahu that Gantz has left?
He's going to say in public that he's probably not too bothered about Gantz leaving, and he's going to lay the blame on Gantz here and try to make him look like he's abandoning the war effort and he's abandoning the country in a time of need. But I think it is damaging for Netanyahu, maybe not for the reason that people tend to think, but Netanyahu, not just in this government, but in almost every government he's had in his very long career as prime minister, he's always liked having centrist politicians there as fig leads. He has a lot of right-wing coalition partners, people who are often to his right, and he likes having centrists in the cabinet so that when he needs to buck his far-right coalition partners, he can blame someone else. He can say, listen, I would love to go along with what you're pushing for, but I have these centrists to consider, and I can't do it. So the problem now for Netanyahu is he doesn't have that centrist support anymore. He has an entirely right-wing coalition. He has far-right partners who are pushing for an expansion of the fighting in Gaza, who are pushing for an expansion of the fighting on the northern border with Lebanon. And he has no one to point to, no one in the center to use as a foil when he wants to resist some of those demands.
Yeah, and it is fascinating when you talk of the ceasefire that both Hamas, which is the complete extreme, and the far right are actually just holding this up. It seems like there may be no possibility of this happening because both don't want to give up, their beliefs and how they want this to play out.
It's you feel like a broken record at some point because we are talking about the same issue holding up these current ceasefire talks. It's the same issue that's been there for months now, which is Hamas insisting on any agreement with Israel having a very clear path to get to a permanent ceasefire, a permanent end to the war that would leave Hamas, if not in power in Gaza, at least intact and a serious actor in Palestinian politics. And You have the Israeli right that is insisting on only a temporary ceasefire. There can be a release of hostages in exchange for prisoners, but there can't be any permanent end to the war. And everything else is just sort of irrelevant almost. I mean, we saw President Biden 10 days ago come out and make this big speech in the White House and announce that Israel had agreed to an outline of a ceasefire and trying to put pressure on Hamas. The Americans are really putting a lot of diplomatic capital on the line to try and push this through. But again, we come back to just the issue that has bedeviled these talks since the start of the year, and there's been no movement.
Yeah. Greg, and Toon, if you look at the absolute devastation that has been disproportionately borne by civilian Palestinians, if not Hamas, you can't imagine that some other militancy will be born out of the destruction and what these Palestinians are enduring.
And this is something that people in the Israeli military, people in Western governments have been warning about really since the start of the war. I mean, Hamas as a movement, it was born in the refugee camps of Gaza 30, 40 years ago. It was born out of desperation and deprivation, and that is what made it appealing to some Palestinians who saw no other avenue to try and fight for an end to the occupation, fight for statehood. And that is what birthed Hamas in the 80s and 90s, and that is what almost certainly will happen coming out of this war. I mean, no one is sure who is going to govern Gaza after the war, whether it will be Hamas, whether it will be a prolonged period of Israeli military occupation, whether there will be some sort of multinational force brought in. But I think what is more and more certain is that the majority of buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. Most people are homeless. Most people will not have work after the war ends, whenever it ends. People will be entirely dependent on humanitarian aid to survive and living in what will be essentially a very large displacement camp. That is going to engender support for whether it is Hamas or whether it is whatever group arises to replace Hamas in the future.
Yeah. Greg, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.